I was unloading my truck full of renovation supplies when I heard the crunch of gravel behind me. 3 vehicles had pulled into my driveway, 2 police cruisers and a white BMW SUV. I hadn't even turned around before a woman's shrill voice cut through the mountain air. "Officers, this is him, the squatter I told you about." I slowly set down the box of flooring and turned to face what looked like a small army. 2 officers flanked a woman in her 50s with perfectly styled blonde hair and a designer tracksuit that probably cost more than most people's monthly mortgage. She was pointing at me like I'd just robbed a bank. "Sir, I need you to step away from the house," the taller officer said, his hand resting on his radio. "We've received reports of illegal construction on HOA property." I blinked. HOA property? I looked at the woman, who was now holding up a thick binder like it was some kind of holy scripture. "Ma'am, I think there's been a misunderstanding," I said calmly. "This is my house." The woman, who I'd later learn was Margaret Thornfield, HOA president and self-appointed queen of Pinecrest Estates, let out a laugh that could have curdled milk. "Your house?" She opened her binder and pulled out a laminated map. "Sir, this entire mountain ridge belongs to Pinecrest Estates Homeowners Association. Every square inch from mile marker 12 to the peak is protected community land. You are trespassing." The second officer, younger and clearly taking Margaret's word as gospel, stepped closer. "We're going to need to see some identification and proof of ownership, or you'll need to vacate the premises immediately." I watched Margaret's face as she filmed me with her phone, that smug smile spreading wider by the second. She was enjoying this. The power trip, the humiliation, the fact that she had 2 armed officers backing up her word against mine. "This man showed up 18 months ago," she continued, talking to the officers like I wasn't even there. "We told him repeatedly that this land was designated as HOA preserve property, but he just ignored us and started renovating anyway. We've been trying to resolve this through proper channels, but he refuses to cooperate." That was interesting, considering I'd never spoken to Margaret Thornfield in my life, but I kept my expression neutral and my voice steady. "Officers, I'd be happy to show you my documentation. It's in my truck." I gestured toward the glove compartment. "I have the deed, the title, and the tax records going back 70 years. Margaret's smile faltered for just a second, before returning full force. "Oh, please. Anyone can forge papers these days. We have the original HOA covenant here that clearly shows this mountain as community property." She waved her binder again. "Signed and notarized in 1987. The older officer looked between us, clearly wanting to wrap this up quickly. "Sir, if you can't provide legitimate proof of ownership, we're going to have to ask you to leave while this gets sorted out through proper legal channels." I nodded slowly, my mind already working. Margaret was so confident, so absolutely certain that she owned this mountain. The way she'd brought backup, the way she'd called it a squatter situation, the thick binder full of official-looking documents. She wasn't just harassing me, she was running a system. That was the morning they picked the wrong mountain to steal from the wrong family. "I understand your position, officers," I said, pulling out my keys. "Let me just grab those documents for you." As I walked toward my truck, I could hear Margaret behind me, already talking about finally cleaning up this eyesore, and how these con men think they can just move into our community and take what they want. If Margaret knew whose grandfather's signature was on the deed to every acre she called HOA property, she would have crawled back down that mountain instead of calling backup. Let me back up and explain how I ended up in that surreal standoff with Margaret Thornfield and half the county sheriff's department. 18 months earlier, I'd been scrolling through estate sale listings when I found something that made me stop cold. A 1940s mountain cabin listed as abandoned property, estate liquidation. The photos showed a solid stone foundation and good bones beneath decades of neglect, sitting on what looked like pristine acreage with views that went on forever. The price was almost too good to be true. I drove up that winding mountain road on a foggy Saturday morning and fell in love with the place immediately. The cabin sat on a natural shelf of granite, surrounded by old-growth pines that had probably been there since before the Civil War. It was exactly what I'd been looking for. A project that would let me get away from the city noise and work with my hands again. The estate attorney handling the sale seemed almost relieved when I made an offer. "To be honest," he'd said, "we weren't sure anyone would want to take on the renovation challenges. The property's been tied up in probate for 15 years, and there have been some complications with the local homeowners association." I should have asked more questions about those complications. The purchase went smoothly enough. Clean title, no liens. Taxes current thanks to automatic payments the estate had maintained. I spent the first few months just cleaning up and planning the renovation. The cabin was isolated enough that I rarely saw neighbors, just the occasional hiker on the old logging trail that ran past the property. Everything changed when Margaret Thornfield became HOA president 3 years ago. I learned this from Jim Morrison, my 78-year-old neighbor who lived about a quarter-mile down the mountain. Jim had been in Pinecrest Estate since the subdivision was built in the late 80s, and he'd watched Margaret transform from just another busybody board member into what he called a one-woman land grab operation. "Used to be, the HOA stuck to the basics," Jim told me one afternoon when he stopped by to watch me work on the roof. "You know, making sure people didn't paint their houses purple or leave broken cars on the lawn. But Margaret, she's got bigger ideas." Those bigger ideas, I learned, revolved around something Margaret called the Mountain Preserve Reclamation Project. Within 6 months of taking office, she'd convinced the board that any property deemed undeveloped, abandoned, or non-conforming within a 2-mile radius of the subdivision automatically qualified for HOA oversight under community preservation statutes. It was complete legal nonsense, but Margaret had a gift for making nonsense sound official. She'd already successfully seized control of 4 other mountain properties, using a combination of aggressive legal tactics and owner ignorance. The Hendersons lost their weekend cabin after Margaret buried them in violation notices and threatened liens for unauthorized rural structures. An elderly widow named Mrs. Chen had been forced to sell her family's old homestead when Margaret's environmental impact assessments made it impossible to maintain the property. 2 other families had simply walked away rather than fight Margaret's army of lawyers and board supporters. The pattern was always the same. Margaret would find some obscure regulation or create a new community standard, then use the HOA's legal fund to bully property owners into submission. She'd frame it as protecting the community's natural heritage and property values. But the truth was simpler. Margaret Thornfield was addicted to control, and she'd figured out how to weaponize bureaucracy. She ran the HOA like a small dictatorship, complete with daily violation patrols where she'd drive around with a clipboard, looking for reasons to fine people. Grass too long? $50 fine. Wrong shade of white on your mailbox? $100 fine. Kids' toys visible from the street? $200 aesthetic violation fine. The residents lived in constant low-level fear of finding one of Margaret's official notices zip-tied to their front door. I'd heard stories of families spending thousands of dollars fighting bogus violations, only to give up when Margaret threatened to put liens on their homes. But here's what really made my blood boil. Margaret's husband owned Thornfield Construction, the company that somehow managed to win every mandatory improvement contract the HOA approved. New community signage? Thornfield Construction. Playground renovations? Thornfield Construction. Safety improvements to the entrance gate? You guessed it. The whole operation was a racket dressed up in Robert's Rules of Order and community spirit rhetoric. I should have seen the warning signs when I started getting those anonymous notes in my mailbox. Unpermitted construction is against community standards. Mountain properties require HOA approval for renovations. Failure to comply may result in legal action. But I'd done my homework. I'd checked with the county, pulled all the permits, followed every regulation. My property wasn't even technically part of Pinecrest Estates. It predated the subdivision by 40 years and had never been subject to their covenants. I figured Margaret was just fishing, trying to intimidate me like she'd intimidated everyone else. I had no idea she was planning to claim I didn't own the property at all. 2 weeks after that first police encounter, I was replacing rotted deck boards when I heard a car door slam in my driveway. Through the trees, I could see Margaret's white BMW, along with a black sedan I didn't recognize. Margaret emerged first, dressed in what looked like a power suit designed for intimidation rather than hiking up a mountain. Behind her came two men in equally formal attire, board members, I assumed, brought along as her muscle. She was carrying that same thick binder from before, plus a manila envelope that she held like it contained nuclear launch codes. "Mr. Davidson," she called out, using a tone you'd reserve for addressing a disobedient child. "We need to discuss your continued illegal occupation of HOA preserve land." I set down my hammer and walked to the edge of the deck. "Miss Thornfield, what can I do for you?" She opened the manila envelope with theatrical precision and pulled out a thick stack of papers. "This is your official notice of violation and assessment of penalties." She held it up so I could see the letterhead, all very official-looking with the HOA seal and legal language. "You currently owe $15,000 in accumulated fines for unauthorized construction and illegal occupancy of protected community land." I blinked. "I'm sorry. 15,000 for what exactly?" One of the board members, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, cleared his throat. "The violations began accruing the day you began construction without HOA approval. That's $500 per day for unauthorized activity on preserve land." $500 per day, I repeated slowly. "For renovating my own house." "For illegally occupying HOA property," Margaret corrected sharply. "And the meter is still running. Every day you remain on this land without authorization adds another $500 to your bill." She opened her binder and pulled out more documents. "Furthermore, according to Pinecrest Estates Community Preservation Statute 12.7, any unauthorized structures built on preserve land are subject to immediate removal at the violator's expense." The second board member, a heavyset man who kept glancing nervously between Margaret and me, added, "We've also documented multiple environmental violations: improper waste disposal, disruption of natural drainage patterns, removal of native vegetation without permits." I looked around at my property. I'd been obsessively careful about following environmental regulations. Every scrap of construction waste went to the proper disposal facility. I'd hired an environmental consultant to ensure my drainage improvements actually helped prevent erosion. I hadn't removed a single tree that wasn't already dead or dangerous. "I'd like to see documentation of these environmental violations," I said calmly. Margaret's smile could have frozen hellfire. "Mr. Davidson, you seem to be under the impression that this is a negotiation. It isn't." She pulled out yet another document. "This is a formal demand for payment. You have 10 days to pay the $15,000 in accumulated fines, plus agree to halt all construction activity pending HOA review." "And if I don't?" "Then we'll be forced to place a lien on this property for the full amount of outstanding fines, plus legal fees and administrative costs." She paused for effect. "Those liens accrue interest at 18% annually, compounded monthly." The thin board member shifted uncomfortably. "Mrs. Thornfield, perhaps we should explain the appeals process." "There is no appeals process for environmental violations on preserve land," Margaret cut him off. "Mr. Davidson has been operating in flagrant violation of community standards for 18 months. The time for warnings has passed." I kept my expression neutral, but my mind was racing. Margaret wasn't just making this up as she went along. She had documents, official-looking forms, even what appeared to be photographs of my property, with violations circled in red ink. Someone had put serious time into building this case. "I'd like to review the specific statutes you're citing," I said, "and I'll need to see proof of the HOA's authority over this property." Margaret's eyes flashed with irritation. "Mr. Davidson, I don't think you understand the seriousness of your situation. We have successfully recovered 4 other illegally occupied properties in the last 2 years. In each case, the occupants tried to fight our authority through legal challenges." She leaned forward slightly. "In each case, they lost everything." "We're not trying to be unreasonable," the heavyset board member added quickly. "If you cooperate with the remediation process, we might be willing to discuss a payment plan for the fines." $15,000, I said again, "for renovating a house I own on land I bought." "For illegally occupying HOA preserve land," Margaret corrected for the third time. "Mr. Davidson, this mountain has been designated as protected community space since 1987. Your little renovation project is not only illegal, it's an environmental disaster that threatens the entire watershed." She pulled out her phone and began recording. "I want this on record. Mr. Davidson has been informed of his violations and given the opportunity to comply voluntarily. When we're forced to take legal action, I want it clear that we attempted to resolve this reasonably." The thin board member looked like he wanted to disappear into the ground. "Mrs. Thornfield, maybe we should give Mr. Davidson more time to review the documents." "He's had 18 months to review the community covenants," Margaret snapped. "Ignorance of HOA regulations is not a valid legal defense." She turned back to me, that predatory smile returning. "Mr. Davidson, let me be very clear about your options. You can pay the fines and agree to our remediation terms, or we can proceed with foreclosure proceedings. We'll put a lien on this property for the full amount of violations, and when you can't pay, which you won't be able to, we'll foreclose and remove this illegal structure ourselves." She gestured dismissively at my cabin. "We'll tear down this eyesore and restore the natural habitat, and you'll still owe us for the cleanup costs. We can foreclose on this shack and tear it down as an example to other squatters," she added, clearly enjoying the threat. I stood there, watching Margaret perform for her recording, thinking about Jim Morrison's stories of other families who'd been through this exact same routine, the official-looking documents, the impossible fines, the threats of liens and foreclosure, the careful documentation to cover their legal bases. Margaret had no idea that every threat she was making was being recorded by someone who actually understood real estate law. I'd started recording the moment I saw her BMW pull up. My phone was in my shirt pocket, capturing every word of her elaborate shakedown operation. More importantly, I'd spent the last 2 weeks doing something Margaret clearly hadn't expected: actual legal research. "I'll need some time to review these documents," I said finally. Margaret's smile widened. "Of course. You have 10 days. After that, the lien goes into effect automatically." She handed me the manila envelope. "Have a pleasant day, Mr. Davidson. Enjoy your remaining time on HOA property." As they walked back to their cars, I could hear Margaret telling her board members about finally making progress on the mountain cleanup initiative. She was already planning her victory lap. If only she knew what she'd just handed me. The next morning, I was reviewing Margaret's threatening documents over coffee when I heard a soft knock on my door. I opened it to find Jim Morrison standing on my porch, hat in hand, looking like a man with something weighing on his conscience. "Hope I'm not disturbing you," he said quietly. "But I saw Margaret's car up here yesterday, and I figured you might want to know what you're really dealing with." I invited him in and poured him a cup of coffee. Jim settled into my kitchen chair and stared out the window toward the valley below for a long moment before speaking. "I should have warned you sooner," he began. "But to be honest, I was hoping maybe she'd leave you alone. Wishful thinking, I guess." "What happened to you, Jim?" His laugh was bitter. "Same thing that's happening to you now. Started small violation notices for my mailbox being 6 inches too far from the road. Then my fence was supposedly 3 inches over the property line. Each violation came with a fine, usually around $50 to $100. He pulled out his wallet and extracted a folded piece of paper, worn soft from handling. But when I questioned the measurements, that's when things got serious. The document was an official HOA assessment for $8,200. The violations listed were absurd: unauthorized fence modification, failure to obtain architectural approval, environmental impact violation for non-native plantings, repeated non-compliance penalties. $8,000, I said, reading the total. That was just the beginning. When I hired a lawyer to fight it, Margaret hit me with frivolous litigation fines. Said I was wasting HOA resources by challenging their authority. That added another $3,000. Jim's voice got quieter. "My wife and I, we're on a fixed income. Social Security, and a small pension. We couldn't afford to keep fighting, but we couldn't afford to pay either. So we took out a second mortgage on the house we'd owned free and clear for 30 years. Jesus, Jim. The worst part? After I paid, I found out the fence was actually on my side of the property line. The environmental violations were for roses my wife planted in 1987, before the damn HOA even existed. But by then, it was too late. Margaret had her money, and she'd made her point. Jim wasn't the only one. Over the next hour, he told me about 3 other families who'd been through Margaret's financial meat grinder. The Hendersons had owned a small weekend cabin about 2 miles up the mountain. Margaret declared it a non-conforming structure and demanded they either upgrade it to current building codes at a cost of about $40,000 or pay escalating fines for each month it remained in violation. They'd owned that cabin for 15 years, but Margaret buried them in so many violation notices and threatened liens that they eventually just walked away. Mrs. Chen's story was even worse. After her husband died, Margaret targeted the elderly widow with landscape maintenance violations, claiming her naturally wild mountain property was an environmental hazard that needed professional remediation. Margaret somehow convinced the county to back her up, and Mrs. Chen ended up selling her family's old homestead for a fraction of its value just to escape the legal pressure. Then there were the Kowalskis, a young couple who'd made the mistake of installing a small solar panel system without getting HOA architectural approval. Margaret hit them with $15,000 in fines and threatened to force them to remove the panels at their own expense. They were still fighting it in court, spending more on legal fees than the panels had cost in the first place. The thing is, Jim explained, Margaret's not stupid. She always has documentation, official letters, violation photographs, board meeting minutes where everything gets rubber stamped. She makes it look legitimate. But how does she get away with claiming authority over properties that aren't even in the HOA? Jim's expression darkened. That's the genius of it. She doesn't start by claiming ownership. She starts with environmental regulations, county ordinances, community impact assessments. She buries you in bureaucracy until you're so confused and overwhelmed that you don't know what your actual rights are. He pulled out another folder, this one thick with papers. I started keeping records after my own experience. Meeting minutes, copies of violation notices she sent to other people, photographs of her evidence. I figured someday someone might need to see the pattern. I opened the folder and found a treasure trove of documentation. Margaret's violation notices, all following the same format. Board meeting minutes showing rubber stamp approvals of her enforcement actions. Even photographs Margaret had submitted as evidence. Photos that clearly showed normal, well-maintained properties being labeled as violations. This is incredible, Jim. Why hasn't anyone taken this to the authorities? Who are you going to report her to? The county. Margaret's got connections there. Her brother-in-law sits on the planning commission. The state? They don't get involved in HOA disputes unless there's criminal activity, and Margaret's careful to stay on the legal side of fraud. Jim leaned forward in his chair. The truth is, most people can't afford to fight her properly. She's got the HOA's legal fund backing her up. Thousands of dollars in monthly dues from 250 families. Meanwhile, families like mine are trying to fight her with whatever we can scrape together. But this documentation proves she's running a pattern of harassment. Proves it to who? Margaret controls the HOA board. She handpicks the members, and they vote however she tells them to vote. The few times someone's tried to challenge her at a meeting, she shuts them down with parliamentary procedure and threatens them with fines for disruptive behavior. Jim finished his coffee and stood up slowly. I'm telling you this because you seem different, calmer, like maybe you've got resources the rest of us don't have. He looked at me carefully. Do you? I thought about the deed in my truck's glove compartment, the one signed by my grandfather in 1952, the one that predated Pinecrest Estates by 35 years. I might have a few tricks up my sleeve, I said. Jim smiled for the first time since he'd arrived. Good, because Margaret's not going to stop at $15,000. She'll keep escalating until she gets what she really wants. Which is? Your property. Same as all the others. She'll fine you into bankruptcy, then foreclose for unpaid liens. That's how she got the Henderson place, and the 2 lots behind the Chen property. Margaret's husband's construction company builds spec homes on the seized land, then sells them to carefully selected buyers who won't cause trouble. The pieces were starting to click together. Margaret wasn't just power-hungry. She was running a sophisticated land grab operation, using the HOA as her legal weapon. Jim, would you be willing to testify about what happened to you, if it came to that? Son, I'd testify against that woman in front of the Supreme Court if it meant stopping her from doing this to other families. After Jim left, I spread his documentation across my kitchen table and started building a timeline. The pattern was clear once you saw it laid out. Margaret would target properties she wanted, find or create violations, escalate fines until the owners couldn't pay, then use liens and foreclosure threats to force them out. She'd stolen 4 properties using this system, and now she was coming for mine. But Margaret had made one critical error in her research. She'd assumed I was just another weekend homeowner who didn't understand mountain property law. She had no idea I'd been preparing for this fight since the day I bought the place. I was in town picking up supplies when I got the call from Jim Morrison. His voice was shaky, angry in a way I'd never heard from the mild-mannered retiree. "You need to get up here, right now," he said. "Margaret's at your place with a crew. They've got trucks, equipment. Jesus, they've chained off your driveway." I drove up that mountain road faster than was probably safe, my mind racing through possibilities. When I crested the final hill and saw my property, I had to pull over for a moment to process what I was looking at. My driveway was blocked by a heavy steel chain stretched between 2 concrete posts that definitely hadn't been there that morning. A massive "No Trespassing" HOA property sign hung from the chain, complete with official-looking legal warnings about prosecution for unauthorized access. But that wasn't the worst of it. My power line, the one I'd paid the electric company $3,000 to run up the mountain, had been cut. The severed cable hung uselessly from the pole, sparking occasionally where the copper was exposed. My water line had been disconnected at the road, with a bright orange cap placed over the meter and a notice zip-tied to the pipe. Service terminated. Illegal connection. Margaret's white BMW was parked in what used to be my driveway, along with 2 pickup trucks from Thornfield Construction and a van from Mountain Property Management Services. Margaret herself stood near my front porch like a general surveying a conquered battlefield, clipboard in hand, directing workers as they installed security cameras on trees around the perimeter of my property. I parked on the road and walked up to the chain barrier. One of the construction workers, a heavyset guy in a hard hat, stepped forward to block my path. "Sorry, sir. Private property. You'll need to contact the HOA office if you want access." "This is my house," I said, pointing to the cabin. The worker looked genuinely confused. "HOA says this is preserved land, sir. Nobody's supposed to be living up here." Margaret must have heard my voice because she came walking down the driveway with that same predatory smile I was getting used to. She was dressed like she was attending a board meeting. Power suit, heels completely inappropriate for mountain terrain, and enough jewelry to fund a small war. "Mr. Davidson," she called out cheerfully. "I was hoping you'd arrive while we were still working. I wanted you to see how seriously we take property protection." "Margaret, what the hell do you think you're doing?" Her smile widened. "Securing HOA preserve land against further unauthorized access and illegal habitation. As I explained in our meeting, you've been trespassing on community property for 18 months. The 10-day grace period I offered expired yesterday. You cut my power line. We terminated an illegal utility connection that was never authorized for installation on preserved land." She consulted her clipboard. "The electric company has been notified that service to this location was obtained fraudulently. They'll be sending you a bill for the unauthorized usage." I looked at the security cameras being installed and the surveillance equipment. "Property protection measures. We've had issues with vandalism and illegal dumping on preserved land. The cameras will help us document any future violations." She paused meaningfully. "And identify trespassers for prosecution." One of her workers was setting up what looked like a motion detector near the chain barrier. Margaret noticed me watching and helpfully explained, 24-hour monitoring system. Any unauthorized access will trigger immediate alerts to our security service and local law enforcement. You can't just block access to my property, Margaret. I can, and I have. She pulled out another official-looking document. This is an emergency protective order issued by the HOA board. Any attempt to bypass these security measures will be considered criminal trespassing and vandalism of HOA property. She handed me the document, which was dense with legal language and official seals. You have 48 hours to remove any personal belongings from the structure. After that, the building will be considered abandoned property and subject to immediate removal under Community Preservation Statute 15.2. Removal? Margaret's eyes lit up with genuine excitement. Demolition, Mr. Davidson. We're going to tear down your illegal cabin and restore this beautiful mountain to its natural state. She gestured grandly at the surrounding forest. Isn't that wonderful? Future generations will thank us for protecting this pristine wilderness. I watched a worker install another camera. This one pointed directly at my front door. And if I try to access my own property? Then you'll be arrested for criminal trespassing, vandalism, and interference with HOA operations. Margaret's voice took on a lecturing tone. Mr. Davidson, I tried to resolve this reasonably. I offered you multiple opportunities to pay your fines and work with us on a remediation plan. You chose to ignore our authority. She pointed to the cabin. That structure is an environmental disaster and a safety hazard. It's not up to code. It's disrupting natural drainage patterns, and it's a fire risk to the entire community. The county has been notified, and they agree with our assessment. The county agreed to this. Margaret pulled out her phone and showed me a series of photos. They were pictures of my property, but taken from angles that made the renovation work look haphazard and destructive. Piles of construction debris that had actually been neatly stacked were photographed to look chaotic. A temporary drainage channel I'd dug looked like random excavation damage. Environmental impact violations, building code violations, fire safety violations, she recited. The County Environmental Services Department has requested immediate cessation of all construction activity pending a full investigation. I realized what she'd done. Margaret had filed official complaints with county agencies, using misleading photographs and technical language to make my legitimate renovation work sound like environmental vandalism. She'd created an official paper trail that supported her narrative. You'll be hearing from our legal team within the week, she continued. We're filing for emergency injunctive relief to prevent further environmental damage. We're also seeking full restitution for the costs of land restoration and community harm. How much restitution? Current estimate is around $45,000. That covers demolition of the illegal structure, environmental remediation, legal fees, and administrative costs. Margaret's smile was absolutely luminous. Of course, if you can't pay immediately, we'll accept the property deed in lieu of cash payment. There it was, the real endgame. Margaret didn't want my money. She wanted my land. 48 hours, Mr. Davidson, she repeated, turning to head back to her BMW. After that, anything left in that cabin becomes HOA property. As she drove away with her convoy of workers, I stood there looking at my chained-off driveway and severed utility lines. The security cameras blinked red in the late afternoon light, recording my every movement. Margaret had just escalated from financial threats to actual property seizure. She'd cut off my utilities, blocked my access, and was planning to demolish my house within 48 hours. All backed up with official-looking documentation and county complaint filings. She thought she'd checkmated me. Margaret just made the biggest legal mistake of her life, and she had no idea the mountain was about to fall on her. I pulled out my phone and started photographing everything. The illegal chain barrier, the cut power lines, the unauthorized security cameras on my property, the fake HOA signs claiming ownership of land they'd never owned. Because Margaret was right about one thing, this was all going to be very well documented, just not in the way she expected. The next morning, I found an official notice zip-tied to the chain blocking my driveway. Emergency HOA board meeting. Mandatory attendance. Subject: final resolution of mountain preserve violations. The meeting was scheduled for that evening at 7 p.m. in the Pinecrest Estates Community Center. At the bottom, in Margaret's distinctive handwriting, someone had added, "Failure to attend will result in immediate forfeiture proceedings." I had to admire Margaret's confidence. She was so certain of victory that she was inviting me to watch my own execution. By 6:30, the community center parking lot was packed. Word had gotten out that this wasn't just another routine HOA meeting. This was Margaret's big moment, her chance to publicly demonstrate what happened to people who defied her authority. I recognized several neighbors from around the subdivision, including Jim Morrison, who gave me a worried nod as I walked past. But Margaret had also invited an audience beyond just the residents. I spotted 2 police cruisers in the parking lot, along with a van from Channel 7 News. A reporter with perfectly styled hair was setting up for what looked like a live broadcast, speaking into her microphone about a controversial property dispute that's dividing this mountain community. Inside, the community center had been transformed into something resembling a courtroom. Margaret sat at a long table at the front of the room, flanked by the 5 other board members and what appeared to be their attorney, a sharp-looking woman in an expensive suit who kept shuffling through thick folders of documents. The audience seating was packed. I counted at least 60 people, many of whom looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. These were the residents who'd been living under Margaret's rule, forced to attend or face fines for failure to participate in community governance. Margaret had even prepared a presentation. A large screen at the front of the room displayed a PowerPoint slide titled "Protecting Our Mountain Heritage: The Successful Reclamation of Preserve Land." Below that, in smaller text, a case study in effective HOA environmental enforcement. I took a seat in the back row, briefcase in hand, and waited. At exactly 7 p.m., Margaret called the meeting to order. She was dressed like she was addressing the United Nations navy blue power suit, pearl necklace, hair styled to perfection. Her opening remarks were delivered with the confidence of someone who'd never lost a battle. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us for this historic meeting," she began. "Tonight, we're going to witness the successful conclusion of a 2-year effort to protect our community's most precious natural resource, the pristine mountain preserve that makes Pinecrest Estates so special." She clicked to the next slide, which showed aerial photographs of the mountain area. My property was circled in red and labeled "Violation Site." For too long, this beautiful wilderness area has been under attack by individuals who think they can ignore our community standards and environmental protections. Margaret's voice took on a tone of righteous indignation. "Tonight, we're going to see what happens when the community stands together to defend our shared values." The next slide showed a timeline of events, all carefully framed to make me look like an environmental vandal, and Margaret like a crusading protector of nature. According to her version, I was a transient opportunist who had fraudulently obtained access to protected land and was systematically destroying irreplaceable mountain habitat. "The individual in question," Margaret continued, not bothering to use my name, "has been repeatedly warned about his illegal activities. He has ignored our reasonable requests for compliance. He has refused to pay legitimate fines for environmental violations. And most importantly, he has shown complete disregard for the rights of this community to protect our natural heritage." Margaret clicked to a slide showing photographs of my renovation work, the same misleading pictures she'd shown me the day before. To someone unfamiliar with construction, the images did make it look like I was randomly tearing up the mountainside. "As you can see, the environmental damage is extensive and ongoing," she said. "Illegal excavation, unauthorized removal of native vegetation, improper disposal of construction waste, disruption of natural drainage patterns that could affect the entire watershed." A few people in the audience murmured their disapproval. Margaret was playing to the crowd expertly. But I'm pleased to announce that as of yesterday morning, the HOA board has taken decisive action to stop this environmental vandalism. She clicked to a slide showing photos of the chain barrier and security equipment. We have secured the site against further unauthorized access and begun the process of legal remediation. Margaret paused for dramatic effect. The illegal structure will be demolished within the next 72 hours, and the land will be restored to its natural state. The individual responsible will be held accountable for all remediation costs, as well as legal fees and community damages. The reporter in the front row was taking notes furiously. This was exactly the kind of story Margaret wanted told, the responsible HOA protecting the environment against a rogue developer. Furthermore, Margaret continued, the County Environmental Services Department has opened a formal investigation into the violations. The individual may face additional fines and legal action from state environmental agencies. She clicked to her final slide, a victory for community environmental protection. Ladies and gentlemen, this case demonstrates what we can accomplish when we stand together to defend our community values. No one, no matter how arrogant or entitled they might be, is above our environmental protections and community standards. The audience broke into polite applause. Margaret's presentation had been flawless, a perfect narrative of community action protecting the environment against individual greed. Margaret's attorney stood up next. The board is prepared to vote tonight on a resolution authorizing immediate demolition of the illegal structure and pursuit of all available legal remedies against the violator. She opened one of her thick folders. We have documentation of repeated violations, photographic evidence of environmental damage, and clear authority under multiple sections of the community covenants to take protective action. Is there any discussion before we vote? Margaret asked, scanning the room with satisfaction. Jim Morrison raised his hand tentatively. Shouldn't we hear from the property owner before making this decision? Margaret's smile tightened slightly. Mr. Morrison, the individual in question has had multiple opportunities to address the board. He has chosen not to participate in our reasonable attempts at resolution. However, she looked directly at me in the back row. If he would like to make a brief statement before we vote, the board is willing to allow that. Every head in the room turned toward me. The news cameras swung around to focus on my face. This was Margaret's moment of complete triumph, forcing me to publicly admit defeat in front of the entire community and the local media. Mr. Davidson, Margaret said sweetly, would you like to address any factual inaccuracies in tonight's presentation? I stood up slowly, briefcase in hand, and walked toward the front of the room. The cameras followed my every step. Margaret's smile grew wider as I approached the podium she'd set up for what she clearly expected to be my public surrender. Thank you, Mrs. Thornfield, I said calmly. I appreciate the board's willingness to hear from me. I opened my briefcase and pulled out a single manila folder. Margaret called an emergency meeting to celebrate her victory. She had no idea it would become her public execution. I'd like to address a few factual issues with tonight's presentation, I continued, my voice steady and controlled. But first, I think everyone here deserves to understand exactly what kind of environmental protection the board has been engaging in. Margaret's smile flickered for just a moment. Behind her, the board attorney leaned forward slightly, suddenly paying very close attention. And I think it's important that we all understand exactly who owns the land we're here to discuss tonight. I opened the manila folder and pulled out the first document, a photocopy that was yellowed with age but still perfectly legible. This is a warranty deed dated September 15th, 1952, I said, holding it up so the cameras could see it clearly. It shows the purchase of 847 acres of mountain property by James Davidson, my grandfather, from the Appalachian Mountain Timber Company. Margaret's smile wavered slightly, but she maintained her confident posture. Mr. Davidson, old deeds don't change current zoning regulations and environmental protections. You're absolutely right, Mrs. Thornfield. But they do establish ownership. I pulled out a second document. This is the original property survey from 1952, showing the exact boundaries of my grandfather's purchase. I walked over to Margaret's projection screen and pointed to her aerial photograph. If we overlay the original survey boundaries on this modern satellite image, You can see that my grandfather's 847 acres include not just my current property, but also, I traced the boundary lines with my finger, the entire Pinecrest Estates subdivision. The room went dead silent. Margaret's face had gone from confident to confused to something approaching panic in the span of about 10 seconds. "That's impossible," she stammered. "Pinecrest Estates was developed in 1987 on previously undeveloped county land." "No, Mrs. Thornfield. Pinecrest Estates was developed in 1987 on land that my family had owned for 35 years. I pulled out another document. "This is the development agreement between Pinecrest Development Corporation and the Davidson Family Trust, dated March 12, 1986. My father sold 347 acres to the development company for the subdivision, but retained ownership of the original 500-acre mountain parcel." Margaret's attorney was frantically shuffling through her files, clearly looking for something that would contradict what I was saying. The board members were staring at each other in confusion. "Even if that's true," Margaret said, her voice rising slightly, "the HOA has clear authority over all properties within the subdivision boundaries under our community covenants." "Let's talk about those covenants," I said, pulling out a thick bound document. "This is the original Pinecrest Estates Declaration of Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions, filed with the county in 1987. Section 2.1 clearly states that the covenants apply only to properties platted and sold as part of the Pinecrest Estates development." I turned to face the audience. My property was never platted as part of the development. It was specifically excluded from the subdivision in the original development agreement. Therefore, it has never been subject to HOA authority. The reporter in the front row was scribbling notes furiously. I could see the headline forming in her mind. "HOA attempts illegal seizure of private property." "But the environmental violations," Margaret started. "Let's discuss the environmental violations," I interrupted, pulling out a folder full of official documents. "This is a clean environmental assessment of my property, conducted by Morrison Environmental Services in January of this year. It found no evidence of environmental damage, no drainage issues, and full compliance with all county and state environmental regulations." Margaret's face was now noticeably pale. Those photographs show a deliberately misleading representation of legitimate construction activity. I pulled out my phone and connected it to the room's projection system. "These are the actual conditions at my property, taken this morning." The screen filled with clear, well-lit photographs showing my renovation work in proper context, neatly stacked construction materials, carefully managed drainage improvements, native vegetation that had been preserved and enhanced, not destroyed. Mrs. Thornfield used selective photography and misleading captions to create the appearance of environmental damage where none existed, I continued. She filed false reports with county agencies, using these deceptive images to trigger investigations that had no basis in fact. I could hear murmuring from the audience. The mood in the room was shifting rapidly. "But perhaps most importantly," I said, pulling out the document I'd been saving for last, "let's discuss the HOA's authority to designate preserve land on property they don't own." The document I held up was an official survey map showing property boundaries and tax assessments. According to county tax records, the Davidson Family Trust has paid property taxes on the mountain parcel continuously since 1952. The HOA has never paid taxes on this land because the HOA has never owned this land. Margaret was now gripping the edge of the table. "The mountain preserve designation was approved by the county based on fraudulent filings submitted by the HOA," I said firmly. "Mrs. Thornfield filed easement claims and preservation applications for land she knew the HOA didn't own. That's not environmental protection. That's fraud." The police officers in the room had started paying very close attention. One of them had pulled out a notepad and was writing things down. "Furthermore," I continued, "the HOA's pattern of targeting properties for reclamation isn't about environmental protection at all. It's about land acquisition through legal harassment and fraudulent liens." I pulled out Jim Morrison's documentation folder. I have evidence of at least 4 other cases where Mrs. Thornfield used fake violations and fraudulent legal processes to force property owners to abandon their land. The Henderson cabin, the Chen property, the Kowalski solar panel case, and Mr. Morrison's $8,000 fine for fence violations that were later proven to be false. Jim Morrison stood up in the audience. Every word of that is true. I paid $8,000 for violations that never existed. Other voices joined in. She fined us $3,000 for unauthorized landscaping, roses we'd planted 10 years earlier. She tried to charge us for architectural violations on a mailbox that matched every other mailbox in the subdivision. The room was beginning to buzz with angry voices as residents realized they weren't alone in their harassment by Margaret's HOA regime. "Order!" Margaret shouted, banging a gavel. "This is all irrelevant to tonight's vote." "Actually, Mrs. Thornfield, tonight's vote is completely illegal," I said calmly. "The HOA has no authority to vote on the disposition of property it doesn't own. Any resolution passed tonight regarding my property would constitute conspiracy to commit theft and fraud." Margaret's attorney leaned over and whispered something urgently in her ear. Margaret's face went from pale to gray. "Ladies and gentlemen," I addressed the room directly, "Mrs. Thornfield has been using the HOA as a front for a sophisticated land grab operation. She targets properties she wants, creates fake violations, piles on fraudulent fines, then uses liens and foreclosure threats to steal the land. Her husband's construction company then builds on the seized property and sells it for profit." I held up the original deed one more time. But in this case, she made a critical error. She tried to steal land from someone who actually had the documentation to prove ownership going back 70 years. The room erupted. Residents were standing up, shouting questions, demanding answers. The police officers were talking urgently into their radios. The news reporter was speaking rapidly into her microphone, clearly updating her story in real time. Margaret sat frozen at the head table, staring at the deed in my hand like it was a live grenade. "Mrs. Thornfield," I said, my voice cutting through the chaos, "you cut my power lines, blocked access to my property, and threatened to demolish my house. You filed false reports with county agencies and attempted to fraudulently seize property worth several $100,000. I walked closer to the head table, still holding the deed. "You also made one very important mistake." "What mistake?" Margaret whispered. "You assumed I was just another victim who didn't know how to fight back." I placed the deed on the table directly in front of her. "You had no idea you were trying to steal land from someone whose family has owned it since before you were born." The police chief had made his way to the front of the room and was examining the deed over Margaret's shoulder. His expression was grim. "Mrs. Thornfield," he said quietly, "we're going to need to talk about those county filings you made, and the property damage reports, and the fraudulent lien documents." Margaret's carefully constructed world was collapsing around her, one receipt at a time. Her legal authority, her environmental protection narrative, her community support. All of it was crumbling as the truth came to light. The room had gone quiet again, everyone waiting to see what would happen next. Margaret looked up at me with the expression of someone who had just realized they'd brought a knife to a nuclear war. "How?" she asked weakly. "Simple," I replied. "I actually own the land you tried to steal." 3 months later, I was sitting on my restored deck, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold, when Jim Morrison came walking up the newly rebuilt path to my front door. He was carrying a bottle of what looked like very expensive whiskey and wearing the biggest smile I'd seen from him since this whole mess began. "Thought you might want to celebrate," he said, settling into the chair beside mine. "Got the final word today. Margaret's plea deal went through." I poured us each a glass and waited for the details. 5 years federal prison for mail fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit theft, Jim continued, clearly savoring each word. Her husband got 3 years for his part in the construction kickback scheme. And here's the best part. They have to pay full restitution to every family they scammed. Every penny, plus interest. The legal payoff had been swift and comprehensive once the FBI got involved. Turns out, using the mail system to send fraudulent violation notices and lien threats constitutes federal mail fraud. Margaret's carefully documented paper trail, all those official letters and legal threats she'd been so proud of, became the evidence that convicted her. "What about the HOA board?" I asked. "Completely replaced. Emergency election 2 weeks after the meeting. The new board's first act was to formally apologize to every family Margaret targeted." Jim chuckled. "Their second act was to vote that woman off the board permanently and revoke all her enforcement powers." The financial payoff was equally satisfying. The Henderson family got their cabin back, along with $30,000 in damages. Mrs. Chen received a settlement that let her buy a beautiful new house in town, closer to her grandchildren. The Kowalskis not only got their solar panel fines refunded, but the new HOA board actually passed a resolution encouraging renewable energy installations. As for my own settlement, Margaret's insurance company had paid for all the damage to my property, plus punitive damages for the illegal seizure attempt. The $45,000 she'd demanded from me ended up being almost exactly what she had to pay me. "And Jim," I said, "I believe there's something that belongs to you." I handed him an envelope containing a check for $8,200, his full restitution payment, plus 3 years of compound interest. The social payoff was perhaps the most satisfying part. Word had spread quickly through the mountain community about what Margaret had been doing. Property owners who'd been living in fear of HOA retaliation suddenly realized they weren't alone, and they weren't powerless. The new HOA board had implemented what they called the Davidson Transparency Rules. All enforcement actions had to be approved by majority vote. All fines had to be based on clearly documented violations of written regulations, and any property owner could demand an independent review of HOA decisions. More importantly, the community had rallied around the families Margaret had victimized. Neighbors who'd been too afraid to speak up before were now organizing meal trains for Mrs. Chen, helping the Hendersons with their cabin restoration, and supporting the Kowalskis' fight against the remaining legal bills. "You know," Jim said, watching the last light fade from the peaks, "I never did ask you what you do for a living. That legal knowledge didn't come from nowhere." I smiled and pulled out my wallet, extracting a business card I hadn't used in this conversation before. "Davidson and Associates, Real Estate Law, specializing in property rights and HOA dispute resolution." Jim stared at the card for a long moment, then started laughing. "You're a lawyer, a real estate lawyer." 30 years of practice, I confirmed, mostly helping people fight exactly this kind of abuse. When I found this property, I knew I was finally ready to retire. The mountain was going to be my escape from dealing with HOA disputes and property law. Until Margaret forced you back into the game. "Margaret made the classic bully's mistake," I said. "She assumed that because I was quiet and didn't immediately fight back, I didn't know how to fight. She thought she could intimidate me with legal threats because she'd never encountered someone who actually understood property law better than she did." The emotional payoff was quieter, but just as meaningful. For the first time since I'd bought the property, I felt truly at peace on my mountain. The constant low-level stress of Margaret's harassment was gone. The security cameras had been removed. The illegal chain barrier had been replaced with my own gate one that actually belonged to me. My utilities had been restored at HOA expense, and I'd been able to finish the renovation without looking over my shoulder for Margaret's next violation notice. The cabin was everything I'd dreamed it could be when I first saw those estate sale photos. But more than that, I'd helped create something I hadn't expected when this fight began. A real community. The shared experience of standing up to Margaret's regime had brought the neighbors together in a way that years of forced HOA meetings never could. "There's one more thing," Jim said, pulling out a folded newspaper clipping. "Thought you'd want to see this?" The headline read, "Local HOA President Sentenced in Federal Fraud Case." Below it was a photo of Margaret in handcuffs, being led away from the courthouse. The article detailed the full scope of her land grab operation and included quotes from several victims who'd finally gotten their justice. But what struck me most was the final paragraph. The case has prompted state legislators to introduce new regulations requiring independent oversight of HOA enforcement actions and protecting property owners from retaliatory fines and liens. The proposed Mountain Property Protection Act would prevent future incidents like those that occurred in Pinecrest Estates. Margaret's downfall was going to protect other property owners across the state. As Jim headed back down the mountain, I walked out to the edge of my deck and looked out over the valley below. The lights of Pinecrest Estates twinkled peacefully in the distance. No more violation patrols. No more threatening letters. No more families living in fear of losing their homes to manufactured violations. In the morning, I'd start preparing for my next project, a small addition to the cabin that would include a proper home office. After all, word was getting out about the lawyer who'd taken down Margaret Thornfield. I was getting calls from property owners all over the region who needed help fighting their own HOA battles. Retirement would have to wait a little longer. I raised my glass toward the mountain peaks, toasting the grandfather I'd never met, but whose foresight had made this victory possible. James Davidson had bought this land in 1952 as an investment in his family's future. He probably never imagined that 70 years later, his grandson would use that same deed to take down a corrupt HOA and restore justice to a mountain community. But I think he would have approved. The same mountain where Margaret Thornfield had thought she ruled with absolute authority was now peaceful again, protected by the original deed that predated her entire subdivision. The illegal signs claiming HOA property were gone, replaced by a simple wooden marker at my gate. Davidson Property, Est 1952. Some battles are worth fighting, especially when you have the receipts to win them.